Welcome, everyone. Seid begrüßt. You might ask, why unser Białystok, our Białystok? So for the Kadima, it's an evening about creating and passing on knowledge and experience. We really want to develop and strengthen this thread of identity, which in Białystokers is particularly strong, through the history of the self, the family, and the community, and in this case, Białystok and Białystokers. Our writers, our readers, our singers and performers will bring Białystok alive for new generations. Those of you who are connected to it through parents, grandparents, mishpacha, or just interest. We'll celebrate people and place, stories, songs, memories, so as to preserve them and pass them down. Enjoy and learn.
Welcome to Białystok, unser Białystok. Biale, meaning white. Stok, meaning river. Białystok, a settlement founded in 1320 on the banks of the White River. Białystok, a Welt mit kleiner Weltelach. Take the year 1900. Białystok is a thriving city of 70,000, made up of Poles and Tatars, Ukrainians, Germans, Lithuanians, Cossacks, Belarusians, and Gypsies, and 40,000 Jews. As a new century dawns, the predominant language heard on the streets of Białystok is Yiddish. Unser Białystok. Picture it. On a Saturday night, circa 1932, the city hums with weekend revelry. Couples are strolling along tree-lined Yankovica Avenue. Queues are forming at the Apollo Cinema. The dance halls are shaking to foxtrots and waltzes. In the Café de Luxe, ladies sip coffee, while in the back rooms, young men play billiards and chess. The Macedonian quarters are doing a brisk trade in Turkish delight and halva. Kondruchik, the White Russian, sells ice cream from a two-wheel cart. Peddlers stand on street corners selling biales, baked rolls topped with cooked onions and poppy seed. Horse-drawn carriages dash by, conveying merrymakers to parties, and from the distance can be heard an orchestra performing in the city park. Unser Białystok. The weekend is over. Soon after dawn, sirens shriek the start of a typical working day. Men and women are hurrying to the city's renowned textile factories. Bishke stands beneath the Stadtzeger selling newspapers. Children are making their way to Yiddish day schools, Jewish secondary colleges, Jewish trade schools, posh private schools, Seligmans and Ruskins. Peasants on horse-drawn wagons are delivering goods to the Białystok market. In the town forecourt, outside an enclave of Jewish shops, stands Yankele the organ grinder. He holds aloft a wooden box from which a parrot is drawing out a lucky envelope with its beak. Yankel is a peddler of sweet dreams. Zisse chaloimes. Unser Białystok. Yiddish Białystok. An entire world unto its own. The workday is over. Night has fallen. The lamps are burning in neighborhood stiblach, houses of worship and learning. The city is alight with Bundist and Zionist gatherings, meetings of aid societies, literary functions. Families eat their evening meals in the spacious mansions of the industrial magnates. And At the other end of the spectrum, in the run-down apartments and cottages of the slum dwellers. In the impoverished neighbourhood of the Kanaikes, where my mother grew up, Jewish families crowd in wooden cottages in a maze of alleys and gasalach. Yeshiva boys and budding Talmud Chochams sit with their eyes glued to their sacred books under the flickering glow of candlelight. The city is brimming with energy and commerce, visions and dreams. But there are storm clouds gathering. Who could have foreseen that within a decade the city would be crowded with Jewish refugees in flight from a marauding army? Or that Yiddish Białystok would be decimated? And that in the aftermath, the survivors would be spread throughout the globe in lands where their beloved city would live on in memory books, put together by survivors and descendants. And in Landsmannschaften and immigrant Białystok centres located in Melbourne and New York. Tonight, we will rekindle some of these memories. We know there will be those among you who will take us to task and ask, no, why not this? Why not that? Why not him? Why not her? Why not my family? Why not my grandmother, the verbrannte Socialist? Why not my great-grandfather, the renowned rabbi? Why no mention of Dr. Ludwig Zamenhof, the philologist who created Esperanto, an entire new language? And why didn't you depict the night that Itzik Munger, the Yiddish troubadour, was in town, somewhat drunk, performing his beloved poetry? And why no reference to little Faverle, the circus dwarf, who loved to play with us, the children of Bialystoker, at community gatherings, Akwelt in Stettel, Melbourne? And why not, please, forgive us, sei uns moichel. Tonight, we have time only for a schmack, a mere taste in poems and songs composed by Bialystoker, in the world premiere of a new film, and in the intimate portraits of 5 Białystok characters drawn by us, die Kinder uneiniglich, family, mashpoche, the heirs of a legendary city, unser Białystok, a Welt mit kleiner Weltelach.
Wie kann ich vergessen mein altinke Heim? Wie kann ich vergessen, von wann ich stamm? Wie kann ich ausreißen mit Wurzeln a Bäum, was steht schon von Deures verpflanzt, min Stamm? Der monst mich jetzt Białystok, ich hab dich verlost. Wie freilich, wie herzig gescheint dann du hast. Die Häuser, die Gassen, die Menschen, der Mund, a göttliche Schiene, auf als hat geruht. Białystok mein Heim, Białystok mein Träum, bei dir geboren und erzeugen ich bin. In Räusch von die Fabriken gefunden hab Artikel, was hat geklappt und nicht geruht, die Maschine. Białystok mein Heim, Białystok mein Träum, bei dir gelitten hab ich unverbrennt. In Wald, Branitzke Garten, gelost mein Jugend dort, mich zieht das Herz azoi und es bängt.
Von Stub bin ich Esther Ostroburski. Ihr kennt doch die Ostroburskis. Sehr an ordentlichem Sprache, poschete Menschen, Amchu. But now I'm Esther Albert. My family, typical of many working class, were first-generation immigrants moving to the big industrial town from nearby Stettlach to eke out a living. My father had a meat stall at the market. Not a real butcher's shop, just a yatke. My parents were observant Jews, even though my mother davened in Yiddish, not in Hebrew. I used to daven too, you know, until I found the Bund. We lived on a very big yard, which we called a haif, in Gumiena Street. That's the Yiddish name. A real Jewish area. There were 39 neighbours sharing that yard, including a factory where they used to pickle herrings. Life centred on the yard. We lived our whole existence there, apart from going to school or work. We lived in a downstairs flat. We were luckier than many. We had 3 rooms and a kitchen. The toilet was in the yard, not in the house. In winter it was really freezing, and we would not go out to that toilet at night. But we had water in our house, not hot. We had no bath, but we had a huge tub, and we children bathed in that. One day, during the First World War, when I was just a little girl, a Pitzelkind, I was dangling my feet in such a tub, washing them. And suddenly, a bomb was hurled into our yard, a real bomb. I can still remember it clearly, as if it were today. I don't know how it was that no one was killed that day. After that war, the Great War, one of my uncles died. So we took in his widow and son and gave them a small room in our house. You didn't send family away in those days. You didn't send parents to a Meishef's Kanem in those days. You just put up 2 extra beds, and it was fine. That was the way in Białystok. The family was very, very close, you know. Aunts, uncles, cousins, all for one and one for all. When I started school, Białystok was still part of Russia. So I actually went to a Russian school, but only for 1 year. After that, I attended the Volksschule, a Yiddish school. My dream was to be a teacher, but it could only be a dream. My parents couldn't afford to educate us. I knew that I would have to learn a trade. So I was apprenticed as a dressmaker, not only to earn some money, but more importantly, to provide clothing for my family. I was the eldest, you see. And that's when my world opened up. I discovered the Bund, or maybe it found me. I joined the Zukunft, the youth group of the Bund. We had great hopes for Polish independence. We became activists for workers' rights. One of our biggest strikes was in the factories, to break the monopoly Polish workers had on the spinning looms. You know, the Polish workers had the best jobs. They were Weber, they were spinners. The Jews only used to get the jobs as nupakes, as not pickers. We didn't get the same opportunities those Polish girls got, and we were determined to end that monopoly by breaking into the factories and agitating. My husband, Shoel Goldman, was one of the great Bund leaders at that time, especially in Białystok. We were accompanied in our marches by Polish police, armed with rubber truncheons, as was the custom then, and they would give us a few whacks whenever possible, particularly since it gave them an opportunity to vent their anti-Semitic spleen on us. When World War II broke out and the Soviet army occupied Białystok, my husband Scholl and the other Bundes leaders left the city. But he came back because he didn't want to leave me and 2 sons alone. He actually thought that he'd find a way of getting along with the Soviets, but he was taken by the Soviet secret police on the 2nd of October 1939 and held in the Białystok prison until May 1940. I'd bring him packages of clean clothing until, on May the 13th, 1940, when I arrived at the prison with a package of clothing for Scholl, I was told by a prison guard that he'd been taken away. No trace of him again. A week later, my boys and I were also on a list to be transported by the Soviets to Siberia, for political reasons, of course. This was a terrible period with arrests and deportations. Naturally, we didn't know what was to come after. The night before we were supposed to leave, my oldest son, only 7 years old, still a child, ran away. Before we could find him, the Soviet guards threw me, my youngest son Label, and my sister-in-law into a car, and we were off to deep in Siberia. We knew later that my oldest son had returned to Białystok, but it was too late. We'd already been deported. Those were the bad times. Life in Russia was very difficult. But after the war, with the help of the Bund in Melbourne, Label and I immigrated to Australia, where I continued a lifelong involvement with community organisations, first with the Bund and later the Melbourne Białystok Art Centre, where I was the secretary until that centre was dissolved. These were the good times.
Whenever Bialystoker in Melbourne gathered at community events, I would be introduced as the grandson of Biszke Zabludowski. We all knew Biszke, they'd say, a small man with a red beard. He stood beneath the town clock with his newspapers. He ran here and there, always excited, always doubting about. Heint, Moment, Express, always shouting, waving his arms, earning a groschen from each sale. Heint, Moment, Express. He was a familiar sight, trotting to and from his newsstand, big ears sticking out to the sides. And then they would lean over to tweak my ears while I squirmed and wriggled free. Biszke was born in the shtetl of Orla. Like many Jews in the surrounding shtetl, he moved to Białystok in search of work. He first took to the streets as a vendor of news in the winter of 1903. In January 1913, writers, editors, journalists and friends gathered in his apartment to celebrate the 10th anniversary of his stand. The tables were crammed with herring, chopped liver, honey cake and caviar. The guests sat at tables gossiping and playing cards as they sipped liqueurs, spirits and wine. A phonograph played waltzes and polkas and the latest Yiddish theatre hits. The Zabludowski children dashed between guests, crawled under tables and resisted attempts to put them to bed. Biszke was the de facto town crier, heralding the great events of his times. On Armistice Day 1918, He flew through the streets with special extras, screaming, "Ceasefire! Ceasefire!" People charged out of their factories and shops, Stiblach and homes. Papers passed from hand to hand, while in the centre of the commotion stood Bischke, the medium through which the news spread, until every Bialystoker was informed. After all, a war had ended. A catastrophe was over. No more wars was the cry of the times. Peace, bread, liberation was the expectation of a war-weary crowd. And for a moment, even pessimists were drawn along by the cry of Bischke on Armistice Day, 1918. Winter was the hardest time to be out on the streets. My father recalls when Bischke came home from work during the winter months, he would bring the ice with him. It clung to his beard, boots and clothes, and his bundles of unsold news. He would arrive cold, an iceman returning to the fold, to be greeted by a simmering samovar and the soothing warmth of that first glaser latte. In the winter of 1938, prominent Bialystoker gathered in Rabinovic's A la Minute restaurant to celebrate Bischke's 35th anniversary on the streets. Among them was his friend, the much-loved teacher, journalist, and writer Pesach Kaplan. The banquet was reported in the Yiddish dailies. Community dignitaries delivered glowing tributes. "Who in Bialystok doesn't know Bischke?" they declared. "He is a city landmark." An energetic Yidder lad running from dawn to dusk with bundles of newspapers tucked under his arms. "Our Bischke, an artist in his trade." When he announces the headlines, they come alive. And when there is an event of great significance, an assassination, a declaration of war, Bischke takes flight. Crowds are carried along in his wake, as if he is heralding the coming of the Messiah, no less. When the Bialystok ghetto was sealed, Bischke and his wife Shana Lieberman remained living in a crowded apartment on Kupiecka 29. Even within the ghetto walls, Bischke continued to disseminate news, distributing Judenrat posters with the latest nasty edicts and demands. He pasted them on walls, in courtyards, to buildings and doors. Resistance members stole by during the night and inked in their calls for an uprising between the poster lines. In the early hours of February 5th, 1943, as the deportations to Treblinka began, SS men rushed into the corridors of Kupiecka 29 and ordered the residents out. Itzhak Malamud, who lived in the building with his wife and child, responded by hurling acid into the eyes of one of the officers. Blinded, the officer fired into the crowd and killed one of his fellow SS. At 2 p.m., the 200 residents of Kupiecka 29 were lined up against the wall of the Nijveld prayer house and shot in reprisal for Malamud's deed. Among them were Bischke and Shana. In a collection of documents unearthed and published after the war, I traced the last poster that Bischke pasted on the walls, number 368, dated January 29, days before his death. And his friend Pesach Kaplan? He too remained true to his calling till the end. In the ghetto, Kaplan organized cultural activities and underground schools. In response to the action of July 1941, he wrote his renowned poem, Rivkele die Shabbosdike, the Sabbath Widow, which expresses the pain and hope of the wives and children whose husbands and fathers had been taken away, never to return. Pesach Kaplan died in March 1943, a month after Bishke. A victim to a meshugener Welt.
Dreht vor dem zu vor dem vielleicht zu neu verstrick. Oi, die Ghetto finstere, du jetzt schon zu lang. Und das Herz so verklemmt, tut ihr so bang. Oi, die Ghetto finstere, du jetzt schon zu lang. Und das Herz so verklemmt, tut ihr so bang. Ihr getreuer Herrscheleis weg, nicht toll, sind von jedem Schabesson, sind von jener schon. Ist verteuert, Riefkele, ja, mit Tag und Nacht. Und ziehend beim Rädele sieht sie und sie tracht. Wo ist mein Lieblingskerl? Lebt noch? Gott schwur. Sie in Konzentrationslager, Arbeit schwer ohne Ruhe. Oi, wie finster ist ihm dort, bitter ist mir dort. Sind von jenem Schabesson, sind von jener schon.
This is a glimpse of Ursula's story, told in Ursula's own words. It was composed by her daughter, my mother, Helen, who wove together selections of excerpts from Ursula's various writings about her own life. I am a proud Bialystoker, although I was born in Lodz on the 27th of October 1926. When Marshal Pilsudski, president of the newly formed Polish government, came to the city in 1919, it was my paternal grandfather, Rabbi Chaim Nachman Bishkovich, the Polish government-appointed Rabbi of Białystok, who welcomed him. Grandfather was the 6th generation of rabbis in his family. My father, the eldest of 5, was expected to follow in his footsteps, but father had other ideas. And so he went into the schmutter trade in partnership with his cousin. Mother's family lived in Lodz. Before marrying and moving to Białystok, Mother had studied at the Academy of Decorative Arts in Paris. She was an accomplished, talented woman. She painted, sculpted, and played piano. In Białystok, she wore the latest Paris fashions. She met regularly with her fashion-conscious friends in Białystok's upmarket cafes. You can't imagine how jealous they were of her unique hats and clothes. We were an assimilated family. My parents wanted us to be modern members of the world. We spoke Polish at home and only went to synagogue for the high holidays. Mother travelled to Warsaw to go to the opera, and father, a bit of a gambler, went to Warsaw to bet on the horses. We lived in a beautiful rented apartment on the top floor of 7 Nowy Świat. We had a telephone and a car, and father had a large study full of Italian furniture and lots of books. We had a cook, 2 live-in maids, and a governess. We holidayed twice a year, summer in Druskiniki, winter skiing in Zakopane. I shared a room at home with my sister, Jareczka, who was 3.5 years younger than me. We were very close, and Mother often dressed us in identical clothing. Physically and personality-wise, however, we were quite different. She was round and plump. I was angular and skinny. She was serene and loved by all, and I was loud and impatient and had a fiery temper. Jareczka and I attended the Druskin Gymnasium, a prestigious private school in Białystok. I was very studious and achieved top grades. I was also sporty, specialising in gymnastics. Life was blissful until September 1939. When the Nazis invaded Warsaw, we packed what we could and the 4 of us left Białystok for Lithuania. We stayed with friends in Slonim for 2 nights and then we moved on to Lida. And on the 17th of September, the day the Germans handed Białystok to the Soviets, we headed back home. We had left the governess in charge of our apartment. When we returned, she announced that she was a communist and the apartment was now hers. As we were bourgeois and could be arrested at any moment, my parents said nothing, and we had no choice but to move in with my grandparents. My father's business was taken over by the Soviets, and he began to work as an accountant in a Soviet firm. Mother worked as a secretary. She began to dress more modestly so that she looked more like the other workers. Jareczka and I continued our schooling in Druskin, but the language of instruction changed to Yiddish and later to Russian. We were also banned from wearing our elite school uniforms, forced to join the Communist Pioneer Children's Movement, and forced to wear red scarves. From having had anything, whenever we wanted, we now stood in queues for everything: butter, meat, milk. And my parents lived in daily fear of being denounced. In June 1941, Jareczka went to the school camp in Augustów run by the Communist Pioneer Children's Movement. I was in Białystok waiting to go to Minsk for a gymnastics competition. And in the early hours of the morning of the 20th of June, the Soviets arrested us. Within hours, my grandparents, parents, and I were on a train to Siberia without Jareczka. The Soviets promised that when she returned to Białystok, she would be sent to join us. But that was not to be, because on the 22nd of June, the Nazis invaded Białystok. Life in Siberia was hard. My father and grandparents died there. Mother cried tears of blood for her beloved Jareczka. Only Mother and I survived. After the war, we returned to Poland and quickly realised there was no future for us there. And so we obtained visas to Australia through the Joint. We'd been sponsored by Mr. Abram Sokol and Melbourne's Białystok Centre. We transited through Sweden, where we stayed for a whole year trying to learn of Jareczka's fate. She had, apparently, returned to Białystok from the camp and ended up in the ghetto. and when the ghetto was liquidated, she was probably amongst those sent to Treblinka, but I still don't know. Mother and I disembarked in Melbourne on the 3rd of March 1948 and were met by George Spar. He took us to the Białystok Centre where we lived for a short time, and soon I met Felix Flicker, also from Białystok, and we married on the 17th of May 1949. Together we settled happily into our new country, but Białystok always remained in our hearts.
Minna Fink, in her own words, interviewed by Jenny Weissenberg. Although I'd immigrated to Australia several years earlier, the war had an enormous impact on my life. That's when I became really involved and realised that assimilation was not an option. I was born in 1913. I was 8 when my brothers and I were orphaned. So we were brought up by my maternal grandparents. That First World War finished my grandfather. He tried to keep up appearances, but the home reeked of decayed grandeur. He still wore the shiny frock coat and tails, but everything was worn so thin that you could almost see through it. Things were so very bad that my 3 aunts, who still lived with my grandparents, started a workroom to help support the family. My grandfather almost died of shame initially that his daughters should work. For me, Białystok was something like a prison. And yet, when I left, I was so homesick. It was unbelievable. There was no logical explanation at all. Just that life in Białystok and life in Australia were two extremes. I arrived in Melbourne immediately after my high school matriculation as a young bride in 1932. It was December, you see. My eyes were used to a green forest, and here everything was brown and yellow, dry and hot. Nothing was good, nothing. I was cut off from the language, and I was suddenly saddled with customs, everything different. We lived an affluent life in Kew. Within a year, I spoke fluent English. My next-door neighbour, who was not Jewish, taught me many things, areas in which I really was a schlemazel and could not cope. She was such an efficient housewife. She could cook and clean and bake and knit. But even so, it never became a friendship. It was just a good neighbour. Just the same as the man across the road, who brought in his silver tea set with afternoon tea and taught me the first words of English. Never real friendships. I didn't have any sense of belonging to any group. I knew that I had to go back to Białystok for a visit, and I did in 1938. Soon after our return to Melbourne, we became very involved in organising for the Relief Fund. I suppose it brought a kind of sanity, got rid of some of the hurt about what I could have done but didn't. I didn't get permits quickly enough for my whole family. It was very difficult. The interesting thing at the time was how the foreign Jews took over from the Australian Jews to form the Australian Jewish Welfare and Relief Society. It was like a mission. My husband was very involved in all of this. He was the first president, and I became the first president of the Ladies' Committee. In 1947, I switched from relief to welfare and rehabilitation, actually, and I became very involved with the Francis Barkman House in Malula Avenue, North Balwyn. It was a lot of work and a tremendous involvement, emotional strain too, because you were dealing with problems you very much identified with. These were my problems too. I used to try to advise the young boys. They knew that we had no ulterior motives, that we were trying to nurture them after their experiences in the war and then in the DP camps. Whatever their needs, I tried to act as their counsellor, their mediator, and it was very important to me. Not just filling in time as a rich lady of leisure, we became very close, and for those 5 or so years, I worked very, very hard. After all that, I knew that I would not study further, even though that little piece of paper does give one an advantage. I needed to do something independently of my husband. I became involved in the National Council of Jewish Women. I was the chair of the 1975 National Convention, and I could now find my own personal fulfillment within the Jewish community. It was an avenue of development for me, and I embraced it. Later, when the idea came for a Holocaust museum, I felt much the same way and embraced that too. I did my own thing. I identify myself as a Bialystoker more as a conversation piece than anything else. Inside me, it's just a thing of the past. The fact that I come from there, and then if I meet someone who is a Bialystoker, then actually I automatically feel closer to them. Arthur Corwell once made a joke, which has more than a ring of truth to it. He was asked what the Australians are. He said in one of his speeches, "The Australians come from British stock and Bialystok."
Das erste Mal hat ihr gesehen und hier gebeten allein, wenn hat kaufen das Gewalt. Und seit schon dann fleckt nicht abtreten, oftmal bei ihr gebeten, sei mein, ich schick dich ab mit Gold. Ich bin der Poretz von ganzen Städtel, leg dein Kap sonnig Kleidl, wart, aber es Malke mach ich dir. Ich will von dir bloß a kleine Naden, sollst du mir von mir abschmatten, in meine Palazze nehm ich dich zu mir. Oi, du mein Baschelte, deine süße Werte, sind so schön wie du. Aber Tate Mame und das ganze Städtel schelten wollen mich. Rifkele, die Schöne, die zwiespige Kleine, ist entlaufen mit der Goi. Und anstatt in Schulgarina grüßt dort, weil ich noch sein ihr Freund. A Junge, a Geschrei, a Gewalt, in Städtelei, das wird sein sehr groß. Der Tate, Mame, es wird, der Bruder, Schwester, euch das ganze Haus. Das ist mein Baschelte, seine süße Wörter, seine so heilig rein. Aber unsere Liebe, unsere heilige Liebe, keine süße Wörter seinen also heilige. Aber unser heilige Liebe soll bloß Rollen sein.
My memories of Białystok are personal. I'm the younger of two children who emigrated, in a family emigrated in 1964. So my recollections are of post-war Białystok, of many ordinary events, seen through the eyes of a 10-year-old child, now 55, was it 56 years older. Stories of Jewish Białystok are generally dominated by loss and trauma. My recollections are different. When revisiting Białystok 6 years ago, I was interviewed by a local newspaper. The interview was criticized by the Jewish tourist guide. She objected to my sharing many positive aspects of my experiences of my childhood in Białystok. That reaction made me feel I was betraying my family by not focusing on depression, on dispossession, on violence, on murder. In Poland, my parents, like so many families, lost important parts of their lives, and many have never recovered. My father, whose first family perished in Auschwitz in 1943, was astonishingly able to resurrect his life in Białystok. And my family was relatively well off. Not rich in material wealth, we were rich in family warmth, support, care. Despite Poles being blatantly anti-Semitic, we were able to establish a Jewish social life in the 1950s and the early 1960s. It was a non-religious Jewish identity in a Białystok that was essentially cleansed of Jews. Born in 1953, the war seemed a long way from me. My parents, my buba, my brother Henry and I lived in a two-story, grey, rented apartment at Ulica Malmeda 32, situated in what had been the middle of the Białystok ghetto. We heard earlier of Biszka Zabludowski, who lived across the road, really, from that building on Kupiecka. Later, that was renamed Malmeda. The building where I lived was once the meeting place of the ghetto Judenrat. I retain a picture of that building as having a wide 20-meter long corridor on the second floor where children learned to ride bicycles, where a headless chicken ran around spilling its blood as my buba prepared it for our evening meal. Our children and grandchildren missed out on such joys. The weather-worn wooden cottages of old Białystok were mostly replaced by Soviet-era apartment blocks, their grey exterior relieved by the colourful, newly laundered guttkas. My Jewish identity was passed on in an Yiddish-speaking family. This included reading the Volksstimme, the Yiddish newspaper printed in Warsaw. Yiddish books, language and songs were always part of our lives. Years later, I sing the same songs to my children and my grandchildren. Though the outside world was Catholic, there was no mistaking the Jewish life within, Even more remarkably, as the winter snow covered the city in a white blanket, my Jewish family decorated a Christmas tree. The children built icons of the nativity scene, and we paraded our creations to other Jewish families in our apartment block. Primary school was a 10-minute walk past the Stadtsäge on the Rinne Kostjuszki. Dressed in my blue satin tunic decorated by a bright red ribbon, I went to the local primary school. There, my memories are of hiding my circumcised penis at the urinal so as to avoid being called a parchati Jid, a bloody Jew. Yet, on Pesach, I brought and shared a box of matzah. The matzah was trucked from Warsaw and stored at Ulica Piękna, number 5, the Jewish Community Center. Across the road, at the local kneipe, the local pub, drunk patrons spilled out into the cobbled streets, not far from the pre-war Jewish neighborhoods. Inside our community meeting place, men played cards on square wooden tables, chain-smoked unfiltered cigarettes, filling the room with a toxic blue haze. And boys and girls flirted and explored their emerging desires. I'm not sure why I have such clear memories of these adolescent explorations. I was only 10. The women made an appearance on Sundays as we gathered around a clattering projector to watch the movie of the glorious Red Army defeat the evil Nazis. It seemed the entire Jewish community of about 100 people assembled to watch the black and white entertainment of the week. Białystok icons included the white Catholic church at one end of Ulica Lipowa and the red Catholic church at the other end, with the Stadtsäge and the Greek Orthodox church in the middle. These are within walking distance of each other. There was no obvious synagogue. The one I remember attending once was in a secluded doorway space, hidden between nondescript offices. The great synagogue of Białystok was burned down by the Nazis on 27th of June 1941. Over 2,000 people inside were murdered. The commemorative plaque is placed next to an iconic cupola between apartment blocks. This memorial is perhaps 100 meters from the Stadtsäge. I passed this space on my daily way to school. Post-war Białystok had only a handful of Jews. Those who remained mostly assimilated into the Catholic community. That my family was able to pass on a traditional Jewish identity through language, literature, food, and customs is remarkable. Leaving Poland and coming to Melbourne made this development permanent for me. And it's only in Melbourne that I learned that gefilte fish could be sweet. The festive dish I knew as chont has morphed into something we know as chuld. I have much to thank my parents, my late parents. Thank you.
Bergen-Belsen, April 1945. thousands of inmates are liberated from what became known as the horror camp. Among them is Dobke Apalovich. Bergen-Belsen is transformed into a displaced persons camp. For many of the Jews crowded into the DP camps, there would be no return to their beloved Stadtlachen cities. There was no family to return to. All that remained was the memory of the time before, of what once was, of a community, mishpache, friends. For Dobke, beloved Białystok was now a memory, a deep, gnawing nostalgia. Nostos, meaning the return. Algia, meaning pain. Nostalgia, literally, the pain of longing for the return. Yes, all there remained was the memory and the power of the written word. A city reduced to the imagination. A city resurrected in a poem and resurrected again tonight, 75 years later, by Dobke's son Isaac, Ekwelt, at the other ends of the earth.
In mein Dimien, Dobke Apalovich. Heimstatt, wie kann ich dich beweinen, als ich kenn nicht in mein Visie sehen a Białystok on March und on Leben. Verblieben bist du in mein Dimien mit dein Schwung und Zappel, mit dem bedichten Geräusch, dem dunkel Granat, welche keulert sich herauf, a guter Räuch, was schmeckt mit Holz und nicht mit dem Gestank von Beiner. Wie kann ich dich beweinen, als vor meine Augen schlängeln sich von Stottzeiger die Gassen und die schmolle Gässlach, von Bahnhof und von Polne zum Schulhof und zu Piaskes und ziehen sie sich voll mit Werbe. Die Kremers schmeien, soch im Balebatisch es gehen, Nupperkes und Webers Stromen zu Fabriken, auf den Tag das Leben zu verdienen. Studenten allerlei mit schweren Teckes und mit Stolz machen es Kinder gehen, wer zerstrahlt und wer verchmarret in Schulereien dem neuen Tag begegnen. Und wenn auf den Ekran in Dimien meinem wacht auf mein Schul, mein zweiter Heim, verhabt mich sotten. Es nimmt darum mich als a Bänkschaft, a Süße, nur a Schwere. Nicht kein Schande, als Chutz die Liebe von den Lehrers liegt mich noch in Tam von dann die heiße Milch und frische Bulke. Oft in Cholem oder Wor, der sehe ich uns die Mädlach acht, von kleinem Zimmer da in Belsen. plötzlich gar in Schäum vom Białystok. Die Neschkes und die Bubes, die Liskes und die Jettes, also jung, zerjachmet, herum Stottgarten zerstift. Nur wenn ich tapp mit schweren Fingern an die Wirklichkeit, dann weiß ich Białystok, was in mir ist da für dir. Ich kann nicht anders dich ermahnen wie zum Guten, weil ich trage noch alles in sich, die schönste Reusen, was die gute Lehrer meine haben mir geschenkt auf ewig. Viel Gestalten leben auf dem Ekran in Dimien meinem. Vollblutige und zarte. Alle ausgemischt zusammen, mein lieber, greuer Mammen. Bergen-Belsen, 1945.
All that remained was the memory of the time before. But that memory does not have to solely be one of pain. Whilst the town of Białystok is no longer a Jewish town, it lives on in lots of other ways, through the stories we all carry in our hearts. Between 1974 and 1986, I interviewed approximately 100 Melbourne Jews who had immigrated from Białystok to Melbourne in the period spanning 1927 to 1964, Izzy being the last one. These men and women reflected and repeated a common theme when they spoke about their hometown, irrespective which side of the tracks they'd been born into, their experiences during the Second World War, or the lives they were living in 20th century Melbourne. As they spoke about their earlier years in the town, whose river ran blue, purple, brown, whatever the main colour of the weaving looms being spat out of the dirty factories bordering the Biała River, certainly not white when they were living there. Their love of their town and the myth of Jewish Białystok had an immediate, immensely strong halo effect. Some of the legacy we see here tonight, in your numbers swelling this hall. We had to change venue to accommodate all of you with your stories of and your understandings of Bobbe, not Buba, Chont, not Chulant, Chob gegangen, not the correct Litvish Ich bin gegangen, mixing up die, der, das, all those little bits and pieces that made up the uniqueness of the Bialystoker dialect and the feel and the atmosphere of the town. When I started my research, I went to YIVO in New York looking for some materials because it was very difficult to get into archives before the breakdown of the Soviet Union. And I was greeted by a very arrogant, pompous, extremely well-educated archivist who said, Białystok? Why would you want to research Białystok? Such a little town. Such a dirty town, such a town that thought of itself so highly, like a Manchester of some sort. Manchester? Lodge. That's a place you could research. But Białystok? And how wrong he was. Close your eyes. Hear their voices now, and the magic of the town will draw you in too. You'll believe, like the Bialystoker, that there was something special about that place, something enduring beyond poverty, industrial revolution and exploitation, Siberia, First World War, Depression, or the Holocaust. They say that if a Bialystoker Jew dies and is buried, he's lonely. But if you put another Bialystoker Jew with him, they'll form a charitable committee. The Bialystoker Center was the first organised Landsmannschaft. We remember when it started here. It was a question of life and death that those remnants of Bialystoker had to be saved. A sacred duty. We just had to do something. Whether it was so in other Landsmannschaften here, I don't know. Perhaps the timing was an important factor too. Of course, when you leave Białystok, you miss the gutters, you miss every little thing, because that's human nature. It was yours, part of you, and this is something strange that you have to accustom yourself to. So, when we Bialystoker arrived to a new place, we immediately got settled within our own circle because we knew where we stood with our people. The Melbourne Bialystoker were unique. We had that unique inbuilt loyalty. We'd been so established back home. Everyone had a place. Everything was set. Then we landed here, Ekwelt, in this strange country where they didn't even have decent bread. Forget about Onionplatzlach. New habits, customs, language, culture. Immigration meant that we had to look for company, our place in society, because those things were no longer defined as they had been in Białystok. We were rarities when we arrived in Australia, looked upon as strange types. But the creation of the Bialystoker Center here in Melbourne, like the one in New York, was also because Białystok was a bit different. We were unlike other Polish Jewish communities. The Jews ran Białystok. It was their place, and that's possibly why it stayed with them. We Bialystoker will always tell you, I'm a Bialystoker. To us, that's part of our dowry. Whether such feeling existed elsewhere, I don't know, but I don't think so. And this is exactly what it was like in Białystok. It was a Jewish town. It was the sort of place that belonged to you. You didn't belong to it. It was a magnet. Truly, unser Białystok.
Białystok mein Heim, Białystok mein Träum. Bei dir geboren und erzeugen ich bin. In Räusch von die Fabriken gefunden Chobatik, was hat geklappt und nicht geruht die Maschine. Białystok mein Heim, Białystok mein Träum. Bei dir gelitten hab ich und verbrennt. In Wald, Branitzke Garten, gelost mein Jugend dort, wo ewig zieht das Herz so und es bängt.
I told you it was a good film. Rebecca, can you put the lights on so I can see if Rebecca's here? Rebecca, you stand up. She's a very shy person. It's a fabulous film. I also, before I looked around this room so wonderfully full of people who probably haven't been to a Kadima evening before, and I hope you'll come again. We're a very lively and active organisation, and this is the kind of thing we do, pulling connections between the past and the present in a way that's enjoyable. And I wanted to say, as well as Arnold, don't be beleidigt, please, if your family were not included in the program. I didn't tell my story in the program, just to let you know, so it's okay not to be in the program. And it just wasn't possible. There are so many, each person sitting in this audience has a fantastic story to tell. And so we just really couldn't put them in. You know, Rebecca really didn't tell her family story either. But she is, and I want to say another clap for her, she really gets the emotional core of the story and makes it flow for all of us. I want to sincerely thank all the people I spoke to, and especially Yonala, John Seri, who was so immediately enthusiastic and encouraging when I suggested, well, you know, why don't we do something about Białystok? He put me in touch with so many other people. He's been absolutely wonderful. And we couldn't have made the tickets to this event such a wilde Metzia, which they seriously are, go find such tickets anywhere else, without our sponsors. So we really want to thank them from the bottom of our hearts, because it means that people who can't generally afford to go to things could come tonight. So thank you very much to the Goldman and Lazarus families, to the Finkel Foundation, some of whom couldn't be here tonight, to Paula Hansky and Ron Merkel and John Seri and Sue Selwyn and Yvonne Goldblum, who really it made it, we could afford the film, we could afford to move to this bigger hall, and that's all thanks to our sponsors. Thank you. To the team who's been working on this show since last August, Faye Burston, Rebecca Albeck, Jenny Weissenberg, Arnold Zabel, Helen Forgash, Izzy Ozwicki, a wonderful team, and thanks also to Harry Liu and Isaac Appel. You can see the results here today of what they achieved. So I'd really like the performers and the writers to also stand up for a big clap. Come on. Everybody. All of you are still here. Come on. Give them all a big clap over there. It's been a wonderful and quite long night. So thank you all for coming. May Białystok live forever in our hearts and in the generations to come.